Back. We are in Genesis chapter 31, verse 14. Let's go. But before we get into 31:14, I'm just going to backtrack to yesterday's podcast and mention a couple things. In the dream that Jacob had, he said, "Here I am." And that's what we want to say to God. When God shows you something, you feel that something in your spirit to say, "Here's what I need to do." We need to be willing and say, "Here I am," not, "I'll do that when I'm retired. I'll do that if I have enough money." That's for the people who are well off, comfortable. I'll do that when my life is not as hectic or whatever's going on, right? We just want to say, "Here I am. Lord, work through me. I'm broken. I'm feeble. I'm a sinner. You clothe me in your righteousness. You have declared me to be righteous. Work through me, Lord." And as we see kind of this inner flow, people could say, well, what did the herds grow because of Jacob's ability, i.e. his free will, or because of God's sovereignty, i.e. sovereignty? And it's that intersection, that inner flow of our free will and God's sovereignty, and both are true. So God was working through Jacob, through the gifts that he gave Jacob, and God was also making it happen. He also knew that it was going to happen. He knew the decisions that Jacob would make. He knew the decisions that Laban would make. Right? Nothing is a surprise to God. He doesn't put his hands on his cheeks in a Home Alone fashion with Macaulay Culkin saying, what's going on? He knows exactly what's going to happen, what's going to transpire, but it doesn't take away our free will. They work together, and he sees the present, the past, and the future all at once. Really cool, mind-blowing. He'll explain it to us when we get to heaven, but right now we know that both are true. All right, verse 14. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, "Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it." All right, so what's going on? Jacob and his wives and children are now officially leaving the, if you will, employment under Laban. Laban is his wife's father, so it's his father-in-law. It also happens to be his uncle. And they're taking off, right? Laban's been toying with them and screwing them around for 20 years. They're like, "We're done, we're out." So this is that conversation that Jacob is having with his wives and his wives are having with him. So it says, "Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, 'Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house?'" There's also some greed creeping in here, right? Didn't you see this? They're like, what left is there? Is dad of any use anymore? Because now we have the wealth. We have the big herds. His herds have diminished. We've got the camels and the donkeys and the servants. Maybe he doesn't have that anymore. So they're like, well, dad doesn't have money. What's he useful for? So we want to be careful, right? We don't want to use people for money, and we certainly don't want to leave people when they don't have the money. We want to love people, whether they have lots of money or no money, whether they are coming into money or whether they lost all their money. We want to just love people regardless of what we would call their net worth, because in heaven, this net worth on earth is meaningless, completely meaningless. In fact, it's going to be more of a burden, I would say, because God's going to say, "What did you do with all of that gift that I gave you, with all of that money that I gave you, with all those circumstances I gave you? What did you do? Did you just pass over all those circumstances?" Right? There's a parable about that in the Bible. So he wants us to be wonderful stewards of whatever he gives us. And that's why the widow's mite is so important. It's not about, oh, you got to build up all this wealth so you can get away and make an impact for heaven. God doesn't need your money. He wants your heart, right? That's for all of us. And we all probably need that lesson over and over and over. And verse 15, "Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money." So here he's taken, he's gotten wealthy because Jacob has done amazing with his herds. And now that's the tables have kind of changed. But essentially he's been, probably not sharing a lot of that with his daughters, except for maybe letting them live nearby and maybe seeing them a little bit, but just happy with them because their money. So they're like, yeah, we're probably done here. It's time to roll. Verse 16, "For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's." So they're saying, you've made all this money for dad, and he hasn't given it and shared it with us or our children. We had to watch you work on your own and God working through you, Jacob, before we actually saw this money come down to us. Our dad's just been kind of forgetting about us. And so, yeah, let's roll. So it says, now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. So they're saying, okay, we recognize that God is speaking to you, working through you. And so whatever he's leading you to do, because he hasn't spoke to us in a dream or in life, we just haven't heard that voice or had that dream. So let's do it. We trust you. We are placing our faith for you to guide us as the husband. And a good husband should guide their wives and their family. Not in a controlling manner, not in this, that makes someone clench their fist and be like, why would you say that, right? We're equal. We are equal, but we have different roles. And the husband is to lead the family. And that's not always the case, unfortunately. Sometimes the wives do it. Many times the wives do it. And not a lot of times, but many times, whether it's less than half or more than half, the husband will eventually catch up and then start leading the family and leading it well. I've seen that happen to many men who are in their 50s and 60s and finally get to that point. But if you're listening to this and you're younger, in your 20s, 30s, 40s, lead your family well in a godly way from the start. Verse 17, then Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he carried away all his livestock and all his possessions which he had gained, his acquired livestock which he had gained in Padan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. All right. Been here 20 years. Remember, he had to run. He had the problem with Esau. He deceived Esau. He deceived his father. He ended up here because he thought he was going to get killed and ended up marrying two wives, not really by intention, because he got tricked by Laban, because Jacob was a con man and deceived people, and so did Laban. And so these two people were kind of arm wrestling, if you will, for the last 20 years. And now he's feels and knows it's time, and God's calling him back to the land of Canaan, the promised land. He's going to go back and see Dad Isaac. But he's gotten wealthy over this time too. He went there probably with nothing because he had to flee, even though he had this inheritance back in Canaan because he had the blessing, and so he was going to get the double inheritance from a spiritual standpoint, from a financial standpoint, etc. But now he himself is going back because God worked through him and blessed him. God gave him a gift. I believe one of his gifts was to just be this incredible shepherd, right? To know how to lead these herds of animals and to grow them and to breed them and conceive them and all that stuff. And he used that gift. And he now has possessions and he's going back. And verse 19, now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. Uh-oh. So what's going on here? So there were these idols that people back in that day would have in their house. And little kind of trinkets, if you will. Maybe something you would set on your shelf in today's, world. But they're actually little idols, little gods to them. They worship them. And very importantly, they believed that whoever had these idols would actually be the one to kind of carry on the family and get the biggest inheritance, have the right to kind of control the family, if you will, or lead the family. The best way I've thought about yesterday when I was thinking about this is kind of like a will. If someone wrote out a will and said, I leave everything to blank, I'm making this up, my third son, or my, here in this case, my two daughters, but not to my sons. That's essentially what this has come down to. This is a huge deal. You probably read through this before and you're like, so you got some idols, what's going on? This is a big deal. So she takes these. She should not have, but whoever is in possession of these is the one who's going to be able to run the family and get the big inheritance. And she took them. So verse 20, and Jacob stole away unknown to Laban, the Syrian, and that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. So they're all rolling. They're not telling Laban. Why? We can look into this and know exactly why he didn't tell him. Every time he tried to do something in the past, Laban would change the circumstances. He'd change the game, change the contract, if you will. We already yesterday or the day before talked about how he changed his wages 10 times. He could not be trusted. So they just had to leave, right? So if you're in this kind of friend situation or employment situation where there's someone you just can't trust, or you're the one who can't be trusted. You need to be thinking about that and like, okay, that's not a good thing. We need to be able to trust each other. Otherwise, people are just going to run away from us. They're not going to want to confide in us. They're not going to want to ask for our guidance or our wisdom or our knowledge. They're not going to want to commune with us. They're just going to flee. And that's exactly what happened here, because Laban had treated Jacob so poorly for 20 years that they just were like, we got to go. 21. So he fled with all that he had. He arose and crossed the river and headed toward the mountains of Gilead. So he's got his wives, his 11 children at this time. He'll still have another. And he became wealthy as the camels and the donkeys and the servants. And one of his wives took the idols of his stepfather, of her father, which is also his uncle, and they're going on down their way. So Laban's going to be ticked. Not only did he lose his his key employee, the guy who made all his wealth happen, who knew how to breed these herds of animals, he's losing a lot of wealth. He's losing the capacity to make wealth. Apparently his sons weren't good at this. His sons were only good at kind of trying to undermine Jacob. And they also took the family idol. So this is a really big deal. Probably the biggest lesson for us is deal genuinely with people, honestly, so that they don't just flee. They don't just want to take stuff and go. We want to be fair to everybody. And if someone's not being fair to us, think about what we should do. Can we confront them, talk to them about it, work through it? Because distrust, dishonesty has serious consequences. Lord, I thank you so much for who you are. We ask for your wisdom and your knowledge and your guidance to lead us. We pray that you would help us to use our gifts, whatever gifts you've gifted us with, for your glory. Whatever money you give to us, whether it be a lot or a little, that we would be like the widow with her mite and be giving and compassionate and generous. That we would focus on relationships, that we would be honest in our dealings and kind and fair. And most importantly, that we would be willing to say, here I am, Lord, work through me. It's in your amazing name that we ask all this. Help us to serve you today, Lord. Amen. This podcast brought to you in part by the Portfolio Protection Store, where smart investors go to protect their life savings from stock market losses. Visit our website to register for our webinar, theportfolioprotectionstore.com. The webinar is about portfolio protection and safe money ideas for ages 50 plus. Visit theportfolioprotectionstore.com. Located in Austin, Texas, license number 2887886.